invest in a fund, which enables them to have exposure to, say, at any point in time, one fund may have 100 companies, 120, 140 companies, and you can spread your bets amongst that. But not only that, the added advantage is that you're working with investment professionals who have a tremendous amount of experience and are very discerning about where and how they deploy capital. And they've learned the lessons, just to touch on your other earlier point around market cycles, right? So we had the dot-com bubble in '01, we had the financial crisis in '08, which really, obviously devastated the economic markets across the board. But those two specific events also really impacted the private equity and venture worlds, because in '01...
Thank you so much for tuning into Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. I'm your host, Christian D. Evans. We have a very special guest on today. Most of you guys are going out there and you have scaled an incredible business, maybe high 7-figure, maybe mid 8-figure businesses, and you guys are looking to scale to the next level. However, during the time, right, your attention is focused on really building wealth and sustaining it, and you're taking dividends from your company and reallocating it. And this is where this next guy is able to unpack those that have $2 million of assets plus 2 million, 5 million, 10 million, 100 million, whatever it is, and come alongside you in your house and almost operate as a chief financial officer for your internal wealth of what's going on at a micro and a macro level. And that's the reason why I wanted to have him on. He is a wealth advisor with Perigon Wealth since 2018. So he's been ups and downs through the markets. He's been in this industry for 25 years of investment management experience in equity and options trading and institutional portfolio management. We're going to be talking a lot about, like I mentioned, kind of that whole service, holistic family office allocation and services that he can provide for you, and the conversations that you may or may not be having with your wealth manager, and someone that like him can align and have the right conversations with you and your family. Please welcome my next guest, the one and only Dermott Larkin. How are you doing today, Dermott?
I'm doing well, Christian. Thanks for having me today. It's a pleasure to join you.
Well, I'm excited about having this conversation because one of the things that I thought was, we talked offline prior to this conversation, but you guys' approach is tremendously, I shouldn't say unorthodox, but it is very white glove service in regards to very, very contextual in regards to whoever you work with. And I want to ask Dermott, because I thought that was really, really applicable in today's kind of macroeconomics, what's going on in a micro as well. And so first of all, before we dive into how you approach that for each client, Dermott, where did you guys come up with that methodology and those kind of idealistic, principles to be able to have that more contextual and customized approach to each client?
Well, there's actually a lot there, so I'll just try and compartmentalize it a little bit. But what we targeted, or what we noticed in the market, was that there had been this sort of increasingly like bifurcated approach in the wealth management arena as to how people engaged in service clients. And what you found was with the larger, and let me just preface this by saying I'm not speaking ill of any other practices or companies that do this, because there are numerous ways to do this. But what you found just broadly in the larger banking arena was that the service component, if you will, to clients kept moving further and further upstream. So, turn back the clock, I don't know, say 20, 25 years ago, if you had a net worth of say $5 million, $10 million, in my book, you are wealthy. You've been very successful. But within the banking space, it just didn't generate the revenues for them. So they continually moved to their kind of bespoke and service components further and further up that asset spectrum. So they started moving out into the 25, 50, 75. And nowadays, as an example, with a lot of these bespoke sort of service teams, you have to have 100 million or more, largely in a number of these spaces, to get individualized attention beyond just simple like investment advice and those types of things. So where my partner and I found an opportunity, and where we really found kind of our sweet spot, was to be able to say, hey, you know what, anyone who has, as you touched on, where our sweet spot really kind of starts to service not all of our clients, but ideally is kind of the 2 million or more. But it enables us to sort of take this model where we become the personal CFO to each of our clients. And we help them bring their household balance sheet into focus, and they can understand what they have. So in addition to their, as you said, with many of your audience might, if they're business owners, is to how do you incorporate your household wealth and understand that in context to what your business value is and what that business represents and what is the bigger picture to that. But then what we also do is we started to link those things together. And the idea is to say, and just as the way we approach our client portfolios is we start with the end in mind. So it's not about what do you have now and what we can start doing now. It's, okay, well, where do you want to be 20 years from now? Where do you want to be 10 years from now? That sort of thing. And the other term that we don't utilize a lot with how we engage with our clients is we don't use the term retirement, because most of, if not all of our clients are super motivated, bright people who will always have other things to do and want to do. And so the idea is to say, in lieu of the retirement phrase, we actually use work optional. And what that basically means is that you'll hit a point in life where the income you're generating for whatever it is you're doing no longer has to be a number. It can be any number, because you've already taken care of the ability, and you know that your future life, if you will, beyond that has been funded, and that sort of thing. But getting back to the original question is why that target? Well, this is where the bank sort of really stepped away from doing that type of service, was trying to incorporate and understand what your larger picture was, what your goals were. They would narrow it down to just what your investment portfolio was. And if you needed advice, if you were looking for help, they'd say, that's not what we do, and would encourage you, best of luck to find another resource. And so where we come in is we have our client piece. And then the separate piece to that is that we have a number of professional partners we work with. So like, we're not lawyers, we're not CPAs. I will say we know a lot about them, so we can kind of set, give very good context, but then we connect our clients with our partners. And then we can make sure that they have a family trust in place, that all of their assets are captured there. And these are really basic things, but you'd be amazed at how many of these little details can really kind of fall to the wayside when people haven't taken care of these types of things. And trust me, I get it. It's not fun. It's, it's kind of a challenge to, when you have to go have a tooth pulled and those types of things. These are not the things that you necessarily get up every day looking forward to doing, but these things really are important, because, in the instance where, God forbid there is, a family tragedy, if these details aren't handled, it can create such a financial headache for your family. And not just simply that you're going to lose assets or maybe pay more in taxes than you otherwise would have. It's more along the lines of the delay. There, especially with complex sort of financial, scenarios, assets and those they can be tied up for, 9, 12, 15, 18 months, which can be really tough at an emotional time. And so these are the types of simpler things, I'll phrase it as, that we really kind of just really make sure those I's are dotted, those T's are crossed, and we're getting people set up and they're working with the right partners. And just the last comment I'll make there is, just as you talked about that service component, is our partners operate in a very similar way. So they're very consultative. It's not just about, as an example, most people, you give your financial documents to your CPA, they run the numbers, and then they output your return. In our case, the CPAs will actually say, hey, Christian, let's talk a little bit about, your life, your wife, your family, those types of things, and what's going on. And they get more involved just to better understand your specific and personal scenario, because then you may find like, oh, hey, wait a minute, you do this business, you run a studio out of your house. Are we taking the proper, approaches there to make sure that that these types of things are being accounted for in how and where you pay your taxes. And that's just a very simple version of it, but this just scales up from there. So in the instance, as an example, where you talked about, business owners, one of the things that we encourage them to speak with their tax preparer about is what they call a qualified small business stock, QSBS. And this is something that's critically important if your intention, again, with the end in mind, is to sell your business. That QSBS, if structured correctly, can result in a much lower tax bill for the entrepreneur exiting from their business. And so, again, it's not what we do specifically, but these are the types of partners we look to work with to make sure that our clients are getting, the best service, the best advice at each phase of both their life and stage.
And I think that approach is so applicable in regards to, instead of just being transactional, it is more consultative, where or strategized, where it's like, hey, what are we
Hmm.
doing in the future? Not just looking back and saying, okay, well, this is what we did. Let's just keep doing what we're doing. Also, I want to
Right.
reiterate. I love what you mentioned, Dermot, in regards to. I've seen this. A lot of Wall Street entities, these large organizations, won't even look at you if you do not have, you know, minimum 100 million, 40 million, 50 million,
Hmm.
et cetera, to be able to work with. And, what's interesting is a lot of our audience, in their own right, when they're hitting that, mid eight figure, high seven figure, business, and they're taking dividends, that's real money. And to them, that is wealth.
Hmm.
However, though, a lot of these entities do not even look at you unless you have, like I just mentioned, 50, 70, 100, $200 million minimum. I know some hedge funds don't even look at you unless you have $1 billion assets. And so it's interesting to have that conversation. And so that's why I think it's really good to reiterate what the value you guys bring, because you do find that these individuals are kind of undervalued, and a lot of larger entities aren't bringing those resources and the immense knowledge and experience, expertise to this industry that doesn't have access to it. Now, I want to talk a little bit about your kind of your overall strategy and your services in regards to. Let's walk through how you guys approach that, because I do know it is very contextual. Each person that has millions of dollars, and just having that conversation, that dialogue, and some of our audience, this is their first time where they're, like I mentioned, they've got some money rock and rolling. They've gotten to real
Hmm.
estate because that's an alternative investing they're familiar with. But there's so many different other
Hmm.
vehicles, and it is very contextual to where they're at. Like you mentioned, they should have a trust. They should have these conversations, this dialogue, what that looks like. So help walk us through a client, or maybe give us a case study of, hey, this person went through this situation and this is what we're able to do for them, because I do know each situation is very contextual, and what offer, what they need, what they look for, and how to strategize for their wealth preservation.
Um, yeah. Okay. I can do that. It's interesting just because there are so many different types of stories and context that I can provide here, but I'll stick with the real estate theme. So when we've met with and engaged with a couple of our clients, and this will just be kind of a base level, but to your point about a basic asset allocation model for our clients who have a disproportionate exposure to real estate, whether it's in the form of second homes or vacation homes, and or maybe they own income properties or commercial property, those types of things. Well, first and foremost, that immediately translates into what the asset allocation model is that will be constructed for them in terms of the wealth that they currently have. And so, as an example, if they really do have, let's just say all in, say 30 or 40% of their net worth is tied up in real estate, well, we don't need to have real estate in our asset allocation model. So that immediately sort of carves out. And so you also touched on another descriptor there, alternatives. And so that is another thing that plays a big role in terms of where and how we invest. And so, as an example, you have the public markets, which are a great vehicle and whatnot, but we also like the private equity arena and venture capital. And so we have the ability and the access to place investments there. And some people may say, well, God, that sounds really risky. And the truth of the matter is that there is a component of risk to it, absolutely. But if you step back and look at the markets, the investable market on the public side is roughly, and this is all in with like the Russell 3000 and S&P 500 and everything else, you've got a scope of about 5,500 to 6,000 companies you can invest in, all in, and whatnot. And that number goes up incrementally larger, if you invest internationally. But the truth of the matter is the venture capital world, and a lot of your, I would say, your business owner audience members would understand this. The universe of small and mid-sized companies is literally in the hundreds of thousands. And that's where a lot of these companies start off. And so what we look to do is to say, hey, you know what? We can work through these vehicles. And instead of people making individual contributions into one company, they can actually invest in a fund, which enables them to have exposure to, say, at any point in time, one fund may have 100 companies, 120, 140 companies. And you can spread your bets amongst that. But not only that, the added advantage is that you're working with investment professionals who have a tremendous amount of experience and are very discerning about where and how they deploy capital. And they've learned the lessons, just to touch on your other earlier point around market cycles, right? So we had the dot-com bubble in '01, we had the financial crisis in '08, which really, obviously devastated the economic markets across the board. But those two specific events also really impacted the private equity and venture worlds, because in '01, there just wasn't anywhere near as much discernment around how they deployed capital. So you really had a lot of money chasing bad companies that resulted in massive losses. In '08, '09, you had similar issues, and for different reasons, but ultimately what ended up happening was the liquidity end of the market really locked up. And so, a company that had venture backing might have invested, their burn rate money, if you will, right? Like their day-to-day, that's their heart, that's the heart and soul of the company. It's how they pay their employees. It's how they pay their bills and how they pay receivables and take in and build their businesses. Well, those monies got tied up in investments that were suddenly no longer liquid. And if you needed to pay if you had a payroll every 2 weeks of $2 million, you didn't have the $2 million available, which obviously put a lot of companies in a really bad spot and those types of things. So where I'm going with this is that with our experience here and the partners that we work with, these are the types of things that we try to guide. And then on top of that, we take this very diversified approach around these types of things, because as you said, my partner Bill and I, we have been through it. We have lost money. We have been through cycles and those types of things where we've been overexposed or highly concentrated in those types of things. And, there's always good ideas always last for a period of time, but there's a time when they don't. And so at the end of the day, where we've partnered with our clients is to sit down and really understand what it is that they're doing, how they've constructed their wealth, and then how do we build a sort of a defensive moat, if you will, around what they do. And then we sort of take our approach from that standpoint and look to build out. And what I will say is, as an example, when we meet with any client, and it doesn't matter whether they have, if they're in terms of assets, our smallest client or our largest client, our job one is to not lose your money. The second is to grow it reasonably and thoughtfully around that. And then, but by having our conversations, which we'll, I think, touch on in a little bit around these conversations, is what do they aspire to? And what is that goal? Because, your dream, the Evans family dream may not be the same as, one of my clients. And so the paths that we take will be, could be dramatically different. Now, the core investments that we do, the models are structured such that we can actually apply this across numerous. We can't do, if we had, let's just say 500 clients, we can't do 500 bespoke portfolios. It's unserviceable. But the point being that we can take these types of steps to make sure that, family A has a certain type of construction, but, they have a lot of real estate, so that we're not going to have as much on that side. We may have they'll have exposures in other buckets. And so if you think about that, it's like literally having, if you had 10 buckets around you, just to pick a number, and they're all filled with various amounts of water for different purposes. And so, your buckets may have water over here and less over here, and the next families may be slightly different. So it's a little bit of a muddled way of expressing it, but it's hard to be too specific around that. But what we really just focus on are what the client's needs are, where the liquidity comes from, and then how quickly they are going to work towards that work optional goal that we've talked about. So for some clients, we have young clients who are 30, 35 years old. They plan to work till they're 50, 55. So they have a very long time horizon. On the other hand, we have other clients who say, hey, you know what? I'm 40. I've been really successful. I would like to be free of these types of burdens by 45. So now we have a 5-year window. So that work optional decision making and what the approach that we're going to take is going to be dramatically different than what we might do with that 30 or 35-year-old client who says, hey, I want to work till I'm 55 and go from there. So so that's really where we try to taper those types of things. And those are the kinds of questions that what we identified when we started this practice were not being asked, to your point about when you're working with the larger banks. And if you have a business, you might be uber successful and most of your wealth is both drawn from the business, but they're not going to necessarily want to engage with you if you're taking dividends from your company, because they're not managing it. So even though your business may be worth $30 million, you only may have an account that has 300,000 with them, in which case there's a disconnect between the service that they would otherwise provide to you if they had your 30 million with them. But the truth of the matter is, we look at it and say, hey, congratulations, you've done a great job building this business. Now we just need to help you, unpack that so that you're no longer quite as concentrated with your wealth to your business, because no matter how well run a company is, there's still the potential that something could go wrong, and you want to make sure that you are thoughtfully sort of extracting wealth from that for the betterment of your family over time, such that if something does go wrong at a future point, it's not devastating to your family.
Well, and I love how you said that, where it's concentrated in regards to, and also explaining where the preservation or building that defensible moat versus offense, which is that growth strategy a little bit and being intensive. But there is a balance within that. Obviously, like you mentioned, Perigon Wealth, as well as yourself, Dermott, that you guys focus a little bit on number one, don't lose the money that you already have established, but then being able to grow that on a risk tolerant basis. Now, I'm curious a little bit in regards to, when you're looking at these strategies, there's tons of different vehicles. And I know, again, this is so contextual, depending upon that person's circumstance. Like you mentioned, you have to go through that thesis, where they're at, what do they want to do, what's their goal, what's their dream, etc. But with those vehicles, I just love to get your response in regards to how you look at it. Number one, in preservation, since that is what you mentioned, and where you obviously deploy that capital for that preservation aspect. That's the goal. And then as well as allocating some of that money for the growth to obviously offset, taxes or offset inflation, and obviously have that growth, because that's what people love, and that's what they love to talk about on the golf course with all their buddies. So love to get your perspective in that regard, but also to ensure that they are in that risk tolerance for your clients, their own risk tolerance, if you will.
Right. Well, in a nutshell, this starts with our first meeting with most of our clients, which is what we call our discovery and fit meeting. And there's really no conversation, or I should say topically, we really do not touch on what the level of assets are. This is more about us getting to know you, you getting a chance to know us, and then us really trying to discern what it is that you're seeking to achieve in terms of delivering, or I should say in terms of achieving the dreams that the individual or the family has. And what we start off with is what we call FORM, and this is actually an acronym, but it's FORMM. There's two M's there, and so the first four letters pertain to the client, and it's the why, right? So F stands for family, and it's just anything that's close and personal to them that's very important to them. O typically falls into the bucket of occupation. What do they do? How do they generate their income? Are they individual business owners? Are they, say, a tech executive? Are they an entrepreneur? Those types of things, because then we get a better idea of kind of what that income engine for their family looks like. The R is recreation, and what that really means is basically, what are your hopes? What are your dreams? What do you aspire to? What do you want to do, with your family individually? What sort of legacy do you want to create, and those types of things. And then tying into that is the first M, and that M stands for mission, which again, I'll tie back into legacy, but it's, a lot of our families that we work with are, people who are community minded. They like to give back. They we have a mantra of what we like. We want people to live well, to do good, and give. And a lot, and our clients, knock wood, are very much in that. They're very community minded and oriented and that sort of thing, and they're very big about supporting their local communities and taking care of things, and it's something that we just love, because there's sort of this unwritten contract, if you will, from a societal standpoint, that we're trying to do the best and create the best world that we can. And I know that sounds very sort of holistic and whatnot, but some people may frown on it because I'm based in California, and it's a very California thing to say, but it's a feel good sort of thing, and we really just our job is to basically enable our clients to do good by doing that. Now the last M is money, and so that's the how, right? So the first four letters are the why, but the last M, the money, is the how. And so what we look to do from that perspective is to say, that is ultimately, don't get me wrong in that is the report card under which we get evaluated on, right? So this is where we have to sit down there and make the determination around, okay, how are we going to position this for the client's benefits? And so I'll comment on sort of the two primary aspects around this. So first and foremost, we are planning based. So part of our engagement is that our clients literally will give us all of their documents, investment accounts, their prior tax returns for the last 3-4 years. We'll even take a look at like their credit card statements to help figure out what their burn is, or what their spend is, right? So we get an idea of kind of like, are we burning as much as, it comes in this door and it goes out the window as quickly, those types of things. And that gives us an idea to kind of say, okay, here's what we're working with, and here's what their financial picture looks like. And you'd be amazed that literally, especially for, people that have an ongoing income flow, that you get sort of, I guess, you just don't really realize how much you're spending, because it just, money, it's disposable. It's so quick. And the idea is to say, not that people are irresponsible, but it's sort of that idea that, the analogy of like, the goldfish grows to the size of the bowl, it's within, and people's spending is very much that way. People always say, oh God, I make $100,000 a year, and if I could just make 100, if I could make 200, my life would be great. But the truth of the matter is all of the other things in their life just adjust to the $200,000 level. So what you actually find is it's not uncommon to find that the person who makes $1 million a year has similar money problems to the person who makes $100,000 a year, or the person who makes 50 grand a year. So those things aren't quite as, there's a relationship between that. So we focus on getting the plan set. And then the other part of this that we really focus on, and this touches on where and how we sort of enable the growth piece, is we start with what does that burn rate look like? And then what we start off with is we sit down there and say, and this depends also on the client, right? So as you touched on, what's their tolerance level? So some of our clients are really aggressive, in which case they don't worry about their burn rate. So we may say, hey, you know what? For this client, we may only set aside, say, 6 months of expenses, and that just gets squirreled away. On the other hand, we have other clients who fall more into that moderate or even conservative category, and we'll say it's not 6 months of expenses that we squirrel away; it's 2 years worth. So now they know that they have 2 years worth of spend at the current levels that are just locked away in very conservative, obviously not going to be high growth, but they will in our current environment, thankfully, you're actually getting yield now, and that sort of thing. But that becomes that first bucket, if you will. So we sort of identify things from a liquidity standpoint as, in many instances, it's usually just first and second, but sometimes we have a third. So you have the first, you have a secondary and a tertiary buckets of liquidity, depending on what client needs are. So as you touched on earlier, you might have a client who has, say, real estate. They like to dabble in real estate. And if we know that they're looking to acquire a property inside of 3 years, if they already have the assets, or at least enough for like the down on what they're looking to do, we may just say, hey, you know what, we're going to squirrel away another 250, 500,000, whatever that dollar amount is. It'll be invested, but at the same time, it's not subject to the market ebbs and flows, because they don't know when that opportunity is going to present, but they know that they're going to want a $500,000 down payment. So that money sits off to the side again. So now that's 2 buckets. So we have the burn, and we've got the shorter term, just if there's any cash needs. Then with the remaining capital is where we start to look at that and say, okay, you, Christian, you and your family have this, let's just assume that we've decided that your work optional target is 10 years out. Now we're going to build the growth aspect, the growthier part of that portfolio around. What are we going to look to do to achieve the growth in the next 10 years? And sometimes, it's not a rosy picture, because if they, somebody may say, hey, look, I've got $100,000 and I want $5 million in 5 years. And you're like, well, that'll be challenging. There'll be a super high risk portfolio, and, could work, but there's also a chance it could not work, and that sort of thing. So there's obviously a reasonable, assessment that's made along that way, but that's part of what we do. So we'll actually go after that discovery and fit meeting. That's when we kind of go away for a month, 6 weeks, and we pull all of that together, and we generate the plan, and then we come back. And what that tends to be more is just kind of a little bit of a reality check. Is the work optional target, in our minds, attainable in that time, in a reasonable sense? And if it's not, then we say, okay, well, now what are the pulleys and levers that we can start to adjust, right? So it may say, hey, look, it's not really doable in 10 years, but if you can continue to work at this level, generating this income and contributing, we could be there in 13. And then it becomes really helpful for the clients, because now it's super informative, and they now can actually look at this and say, I now have a goal. This is where I am. This is what I want. And again, it also just depends on what they're looking to achieve. Like, if there's a client who comes to us and says, hey, on an annual basis, I want to be able to spend $500,000 in disposable income. after I've paid my taxes, after I've taken care of my utilities, like all of the fixed costs that you have to live, they want $500,000 to spend however they see fit. And if that's the case, we say, all right, well, you know what? You're probably going to need roughly 15 million in assets, invested in the market in order to do that and not deplete it, and those types of things. And then a number of our models will show that on the projections. It'll just show there's some people who could sit down there and say, hey, there's a book out there by the author's name is Bill Perkins, and it's like Die with Zero. So it's the idea of living your life, contributing to society in an ongoing basis, living a good life. But at the end of the day, as you approach your death, you have very little in the way of assets to pass on. And that's one school of thought. On the other hand, you have people who say, hey, look, I'm building this. I'm looking to build multi-generational wealth. I want to take care of my family, not only for my kids, but my grandkids and my great-grandkids and so on and so forth. Well, different model, different approach in terms of the assets. And largely that gets based around, at that point, how do we protect it? But more importantly then, is it just well allocated? Because the idea then becomes what we're looking to avoid when you think of market charts, especially, let's just look at the last 3 years, 4 years now with COVID and just, the recent, coming out of COVID and some of the economic experiences we've had. You've had a very herky-jerky market. And the idea for us is we don't like peaks and valleys. We look to kind of have more a rolling pattern. And so, we believe in being fully invested in the market. We don't go to cash. We obviously are, if a client has cash, like as an example for the clients who've had cash this year, we've really kind of slow rolled that investment. Not because we're market timing, because we really don't know. The truth of the matter is, it's just that, but we felt comfortable with the volatility that, hey, you know what, if we don't invest this month, sometime in the next 2 or 3 months, we'll have an entry point that'll be equally compelling, and that type of thing. And ultimately, if the market does run in one direction and we kind of missed it, well, that's kind of the risk we run by sitting on cash, which is why our mantra is to be as invested as we can be, and as much as the client is comfortable. And that comes back to your earlier question around suitability and what are they comfortable with, and largely, if we've taken care of the liquidity buckets that I was talking about, meaning they're whatever the cash run that is that they want to have set aside, that 6 months or 2 year, and then we also know that in the intermediate spend, that if we have another $500,000 squirreled away, well, now we can actually be much more comfortable being aggressive on the growth side, because we've taken care of the stuff that is going to, we hate if our clients are not sleeping at night. And that's why that, again, it's really about understanding what is there, because some people will tell you, oh, I'm super aggressive. And then after having, spent a few hours together talking to them, we come away and we're like, you know what? Christian's not as aggressive as he thinks.
That's
so
very
sorry,
powerful.
I kind of prattled on there a bit.
No, that's brilliant. And you really gave a lot of context and color to kind of your approach. And that's exactly what I wanted to share. And what I find so interesting, and maybe you could speak on this a little bit as well, Dermott, is that there are so many individuals that we have, definitely as business owners and a previous business owner, where we have these amazing experts. And we are humble as business owners to find experts like CFOs and operators and people to delegate that are really good at what they do isolated, right? But for some odd reason, we don't have that same thought process or that same thesis or approach into our own personal wealth for whatever reason. And so that's why I wanted to have people like yourself on to be able to say, hey, it's okay. You need someone like Dermott that lives and breathes these financial vehicles, these ins and outs, and has a huge team to be able to work through this and get a really, contextual and customized approach to say, hey, where are we at? What are we doing? It's the same approach that you would have with your business, right? Hey, how are we going to grow and scale this company in 5 years? Or what does that look like? It's the same thing with your own, but you need someone that can, that's an expert in this industry. So appreciate that approach. I want to ask you also, I've had a friend I want to share with you. His business within the last few years just exploded, and he had like a $20 million tax bill. And my question really isn't about like what to do in that situation, because obviously that's, again, contextual. It's more of, I know some people that are listening to this podcast that have exploded their business, and their business is like, wow, now we're taking massive dividends. And like you mentioned, it's like, hey, all these other things are checked off. We got preservation, cool. We're in those vehicles, like you mentioned, all that's set. We're fantastic. With the next X amount of years, we're going to get that goal of, 20 million, $30 million. Cool, wonderful, awesome. But now it's grown and it's, or it could be the other way where it's kind of depleted. And now we kind of, the burn rates increase. We got to really, skim our resources and so forth. So my question though is when the landscape changes, how do you guys
Mhm.
adjust the plan? Like you mentioned, it is those levers, those pulleys. And I love to understand how you guys approach that because obviously the landscape is changing and it's a never ending change. But I love to just see how you guys approach it in regards to, okay, hey, this is priority, then this is priority, and then of course, obviously, whatever that comes down to. So I love to unpack that process.
Okay. Well, in some respects, it won't be quite as, I guess, earth-shatteringly insightful. But I think, the analogy that you just sort of touched on with, especially, let's just focus on sort of the folks in your audience that are business owners, right? So, like you said, they have a very keen insight into how they run their business, and they know where the growth drivers are. They know where their burn is and their spend is, and so you have some key players within your company, I'll assume so. Let's just assume it's not like just a one person shop, right? So you probably have someone who's overseeing your accounting and your finance, and acting in sort of that CFO role. And that sort of thing. You probably have someone on the sales side, maybe driving that effort for you. And then to the extent that you need it and there's a role for it, maybe you even have like a marketing/advertising, right? So you have these different heads that are all sort of trying to run the business, all of whom report up to you, the founder and the owner of the business. But the beauty of that is that you've been smart enough to sort of delegate, right? You're not wearing all 5 hats on your own. And I know a lot of entrepreneurs have to, so don't get me wrong, I totally appreciate that. It's actually part of what Bill and I do with our practice, and that sort of thing. But my point in that is that from the household perspective, that's sort of one of the roles that we assume for you as that personal CFO. And that means that we have the balance sheet. We can see what's working, what's not. And to your point, if we know that work optional target is, say, 10 years out, and we start to look at that and say, hey, wait a minute, you know what, Christian, your home spend has gone up. We're tracking this, and let's just say, like, if you on a month-over-month basis used to spend 20 grand a month, and we see that's now 30,000, 35,000, and it's not a one-time blip where maybe you're like, oh, well, we bought a car, or we did an improvement on the house, or that type of thing, but we just see a continual rise in your burn. Well, you know what? Okay, there's a problem now, in the sense that, and it's not bad in the sense of like, hey, you're doing this, but it's our job to help call that out, to make you aware of it, and then to know, like, okay, this is beginning to impact the balance sheet over here, and this is going to impact the ability to hit that 10-year work optional horizon. And so that's our first job, is to sort of identify that in terms of the trend or the pattern. The next piece of that, and again, I'll tie this back into the business, is if you have a company that's growing and is really successful, part of this network, as you talked about, being operators and connectors, part of where we bring value is that we try to, and we're continually evolving this. We don't claim to know everyone. We're always looking to meet new and amazing people. But the point is we find partners that we align ourselves with. So as an example, if there's an entrepreneur looking for an exit, well, we work with business lawyers who help do M&A and enable you to do that. And they're, obviously, if you have a company that is going to be acquired by, say, Google, chances are Google knows who you are. You don't need us for that. On the other hand, if you have a smaller company, like one of our clients has a digital marketing company, and so just contextually, understanding what they do, instead of let's say Xbox marketing their own stuff, they'll engage with this agency to do that on their behalf. And so he comes in and he's sort of this agency, partner now with Microsoft/Xbox to help them, push their platform and products out into like social media. So they'll come up with a social media campaign, and they have the targeted people to know where and how to do this. Well, his company's growing, and so he was saying, look, I'm beginning to get feelers from people saying they really like what we're doing. We may get acquired here. And so we were able to reach out to a handful of the folks that we know to say, hey, here's Christian. He's got this company. Seems to have a lot of promise, and there seems to be some interest here, but he could use some advice. And so we make an introduction. And again, it's not what we do in terms of our specific business, but we make that introduction. You start speaking with that lawyer or that firm. They actually start to help you kind of understand, okay, what is your value? What does it look like? And that type of thing, and understand that. And maybe they help you sort of tighten up And there's a number of other partners that we work with, but maybe we have another partner that specializes in operational efficiencies, and so they'll come in and look at how your company's being run and just being like, hey, you know what, this is like an outdated way or whatever. They'll just help you identify just areas where you can just tighten it down the bolts a little bit more, run yourself a little bit more efficiently, improve your revenue model, that type of thing, and that sort of thing. So that's kind of the upside. And then to the downside, that's the other thing too. Well, we'll look at it and say, hey, you know what? Over the last 3 years, your revenues have been falling off with the business, and we're not calling them out on it. It's just to say, hey, have you really thought about this? And it might accelerate an exit, because somebody may say, hey, you know what? I'm in an industry now where there are too many competitors coming in, and the advantage I had 5 years ago or 10 years ago is no longer there. And then the idea is to say, okay, well, let's see, maybe we can find a couple of other people where somebody may say, hey, there's still value in your business, and if you were to merge with another company that maybe has figured out what the next curve is there, and those types of things. So I guess in one respect, there's no one way to just simply answer how we address it. The idea is to say that what you have in partnering with us is that partner who's with you and is just trying to protect that broader plan from the perspective of, here's my family, I want to take care of them, but the business is the largest driver of that, which means it's obviously very important to us. But we're sitting, kind of shotgun with you in the car. We're riding there side by side and being that navigator while you're, hands on the wheel and taking in, the landscape of everything in front and in behind you. And we just try to contribute as best as we can and where we can. And the nice thing about that is, I think from that perspective is that once we've engaged and that person's a client, this is always ongoing. So we don't just wait to talk to you, as an example, at year end to say like, oh, here's your review. I'm going to just drop emails to you or pick up the phone and be like, hey, Christian, I know it's whatever, February, it's March 1st today. How you doing? How are things? And we'll just do a check-in, and it might just, I may do it at the beginning of the day, at the end of the day, that sort of thing. Because especially once I've gotten to know you, I'm like, oh, I know that Chris likes to run, in the afternoons. Maybe I'll just throw him a call at the beginning or the back end of his run, and we'll only talk for 5 or 10 minutes, but it's just, those are like just little pulse checks. How are things? How's the family? Is there anything going on? Because there's all sorts of things that can throw people off. You can have someone who gets diagnosed with cancer, kid gets hit by a car. There's any number of things that you just kind of, these life challenges that just present themselves, and they can have, I'd say like unexpected impacts on where you are and that sort of thing. Because we've had some clients who they're like, they just feel like suddenly they feel the weight and the pressure of what they're doing. And sometimes it's just, you're just that voice of just, hey, Christian, you're doing a great job. Family's healthy, the business is running well. I know it's, kind of stressful and everything else, but you know what? Hey, I'll tell you what, instead of that 4-mile run today, why don't you do 7? Just really kind of push yourself and crank it out, and just kind of get those negative thoughts out of your head. And it's just nice to be able to have that partner around that. And we really enjoy it, because what it enables us, the satisfaction that we get is that we really now feel that we truly are embedded with our clients. And I think that's the thing, is just, and I'm going to pivot here a little bit, but just in terms of our practice, it's like, we don't aspire to have like 2,000 clients, because we're a finite resource. We cannot deliver the level of service that we want. So we're trying to find, we actually, in some respects, we want to be as scarce as we can so that we can work with the, it's almost the inverse funnel, instead of it being a pyramid, or the inverse, the pyramid. We really do like the idea of it getting here. And the idea is not because we're, super, what's the term, selective about who we work with. It's not because it's like, hey, you don't have enough assets or you're not good enough to work with. It's more along the lines of, if we can't deliver to you what we are delivering to our other clients, then we're failing you. And so it's just that awareness to know that we are finite. We can only grow so much. And we also know that our model doesn't necessarily extrapolate. Like if we suddenly had 50 people or 75 people working with us, chances are the service level and quality wouldn't be the same.
Well, what's interesting to me is, what you were saying there reminds me of like that offense is only as good as your defense kind of approach. And what I've
Hmm.
noticed is when people are in this new stage of wealth where they are taking dividends, where they're, and maybe their first founder, second founder, whatever it may be, and they've got that situation, and you need someone to run point, like Paragon Wealth, that's able to, okay, well, hey, client A, we need to start thinking about building a trust. We need to start thinking about insurance, business insurance, whatever it may be, right?
Hmm.
Life insurance or other insurance instruments, right? And so again, it's not, it's really being building that defense and bringing attention, what I have come to understand, bringing awareness to something that I may not be aware of, because this is not my subject matter expert. I'm not an expert in this industry,
Hmm.
but obviously you have worked with a lot of clients in that evolution and a lot of different kind of journeys themselves, and said, okay, hey, this is where we're at. Maybe these are certain green flags or red flags we should be aware of, and be able to build out the right infrastructure. And what I've come to understand from my own journey, I came from a very, poor family, relatively poor family, obviously built on my own wealth and so forth, which is nice. Again, humbled, not to the extreme of nine figures or anything. But the thing is, though, what I learned is there's different caliber of wealth managers. There are some that are your best friends from college and so forth that, hey, cool,
Right.
wonderful. But then there's others that obviously say, okay, hey, and I love this. And I want to reiterate what you mentioned, where they look out 5, 10, 15 years. And they're not just looking back and saying, okay, hey, give me your documents. Cool, wonderful, sign them off, chat with you next year, right? It's really sitting there and say, hey, what is our plan? What is our strategy? What is our tactic to be able to build, sustain, and preserve your wealth going from here forward? And that's just like you mentioned, other avenues that people may not be aware of. So you mentioned a few, and I want to loop back around on this. When you have a
Hmm.
conversation with your clients, what are certain questions that you have found that maybe they should be asking that they may not be aware that they should be asking? And what I mean by that is, oh, should I have a trust? Because a lot of people, we think maybe
Hmm.
down in the future when I'm 60, 70 years old and I'm going to retire and almost dead, that's when I should build a trust. And the reality is that conversation should actually be a little sooner than we may anticipate. Or how to build other different LLCs within our organization or our systems, or, obviously real estate and vice versa. And there's a lot of different structures that,
Hmm.
again, I know you don't run legal. I know you don't run the tax side of things. However, though, it's just more of the conversation about what questions or what things they should be aware of, what vehicles that they should be aware of that they may not be aware of until obviously you bring that to attention.
Well, in some respects, it's really just again about sort of dotting the i's and crossing the t's. And what I mean by that is to your point, if you wait till somebody's in the late stages of life, right, the 60, 70, 80, 90 year old grandfather or parent and whatnot, and let's say they've lived in their home for 50 years, you know I'm about 90% certain that if you ask them to pull the deed, more than half of them would have no idea where the deed to the property is. And so, just as one example of that is just that from a legal perspective, you now are going to have a challenge to prove that you actually own the house. Now it's documented. I mean, you paid, you made all the, or your parent, or this person, I should say, has made all of the mortgage payments, and somewhere in some file, it says that Christian Evans is the owner of this house. But the very basic nature of it is that if that when that person passes, and you the son-in-law or the son or the daughter and the daughter-in-law, or the granddaughter, even worse, just because there's just a generational separation. Now you've got to go through that house and you've got to find these documents, because if you can't, you suddenly run into, now it's like wherever the state is, and like I said, I'm based here in California, but the state of California will be like, well, we're doing a reassessment of the value of the house, and hey, congrats, your parents bought this in 1962 for $7,000, but it's now worth $4 million. The tax bill's at $4 million, and if you haven't been able to manage and handle all of this, there's numerous ramifications that kick in, and that's just on the house, right? So now add the complexity of, this person having a ton of assets. That, let's say they invested well and they've accrued, additional wealth aside from what their real estate looks like. You have the very same challenges coming now, because they say, oh, we lost Grandpa Joe, but it turns out Grandpa Joe had an individual account that has grown to be $7 million in assets, but there was no trust in place for those monies to be transferred down. And so what you find again is that you get hit with an otherwise what I'll call egregious sort of tax bill, to the family, and you haven't been able to do that. So the point in that is just what you want people to understand is there are things at risk that they don't appreciate at the time. And then at some point you sit down there and just go, oh my God, this was a mess. And then if you actually do have to engage with professionals to try and help you solve that problem, it's not readily and quickly resolved. It's not something you can say like, oh, you know what? I got this lawyer, he's going to come in, and the CPA, and we're going to fix this in 2 weeks. This is literally going to take 6, 9, 12, 15 months, depending on how quickly they can find it, where they can find, they have to do research records in the public realm, those types of things. But also, what's the level of complexity to that? Because it's one thing if you're trying to solve, say, $1 million, estate, but if it's a $15 or $20 million estate, it just exponentially gets harder and more challenging. The other piece of this is people not necessarily understanding kind of where they were when they started their business and then where they've grown to. And so one of the things that we talk about here, and I'm going to use it as the verb, but it's like, hey, Christian Evans, are you Googleable? If I type in your name, what's going to pop up? And the truth of the matter is, when you started your business, nobody knew who you were. You were just this anonymous person, and you were one of a sea of 10,000 Christian Evanses. But now they know who you are. Well, let's assume, and I'm going to put on my ambulance chaser hat here a little bit, but you have a party at your house, and someone slips and falls on your deck, and they're a guest, they're a friend of a guest of yours, and suddenly they realize, well, hey, Chris is worth X. They fell, they hurt their ankle, they're suing you for $2 million. Well, if you don't have umbrella coverage, you personally could be liable, for that $2 million if in fact it goes to a trial and I'm presuming a lot of things coming out against you in this scenario. But the point in all this is that what people just don't understand necessarily is sort of the things that are at risk that seem very benign or almost unknown to you until something occurs. But the problem is that when that event occurs, that negative event, you can't say, pause, wait, let me go get the insurance or let me get the trust in place. It's too late. And so that's the issue. So it's like, it's sort of that idea of think of it this way, people say well, why do I need home insurance? I have this house, I've been in it for 30 years, it's never had a fire. Well, you don't care about the insurance until the house burns down. And, so again, it's one of those things where it's a backward looking thing at the time where you're like, oh, it's so stupid. I should have done this, or you feel stupid because you didn't do it, and that sort of thing. And so at the end of the day, that's the reason we have these conversations and want to know about these types of things, because we've been through this. We've seen what people have dealt with, and you see the heartache. And then the other problem for this is that if people don't have certain things in place, we, meaning, Bill and I specifically, our ability to assist our clients is also limited, because we can only help them go so far, and then we have to turn it over to someone else. Whereas if clients are working with us, we make sure that all the designated beneficiaries are in place. Is it updated? And as an example, if maybe you or somebody, they have an event where maybe they sell their business or they buy a third or fourth house or whatever it is that they're doing, we're the one that's reaching up going, hey, I know, Chris, you guys sold on that house and things are great and everything else, but you need to talk to your trust and estate attorney. You need to add that asset in to your trust, because again, if something happens and some of your assets aren't in it, they're not protected by the trust, even though the trust exists, because you never added it to the trust. And this is all really detailing and not necessarily super sexy, but it's really smart. These are the types of things when, if people have their houses in order, this is the type of thing that you achieve. And that's the kind of thing that we're just looking at. It's just a checklist of things. And there's a lot of stuff here, and I know we're coming up on our time, but, that we run through. So over the course of our relationship with our clients, part of the reason we're so deliberate about who we work with is that we envision it. To your point, we're not transactional. We're envisioning a lifetime partnership, working with you and your family, and hopefully for generations. And if that's the case, we're going to try and get as much of that stuff in place and as tightly wound and with a bow on it, so that these are the types of things that you never worry about, and that because life events are going to happen. We're all going to die at some point, but we can help each other, or we can help our clients to be as well positioned to manage and navigate all of that and their heirs. and those types of things. So it's really important, but it's like not the sexiest of things.
Well, that's why I think it's the unsexy things or the boring things, quote unquote, that I always love to talk about, is that what actually gets you to preserve that the next level. It's and what I found, and I appreciate you bringing up that example where there are those skeletons in the closet, if you will, that you're not
Hmm.
aware of, that you're not prepared for, but you have to anticipate to some extent. And that's why, I love you guys' approach because, like I mentioned, you guys are very proactive. We're able to have that conversation with the client and you know what questions to ask. You say, hey, client, do you have these certain things for defense measures in case this circumstance does happen? And it's not like that
Hmm.
it will happen. It's just that if it does, then you are prepared. Like you said, you don't want to be sitting there and your house is flooded, your house is burning down, and you're like, oh crap, I should have, right? You say, I'm glad I
Right.
did, and you have those defensive. Like it's that cost ratio. And is it worth the cost? I think it is over a long time period. And I can't tell you, Dermot, off the record as well, and having a conversation with a lot of my friends offline, I've seen some people that built incredible businesses, and by one or two of those
Hmm.
situations happening, specifically legal actions. Um,
Yep.
Suing, whatever, that can deplete your income very, very quickly if you are not protected in the right measures. So, just reiterating that one thing real quick. Dermot, I really appreciate you being on here. And first of all, I just love you guys' strategy, your methodology in regards to your approach with each client, and very custom, very white glove, very integrated into where they're at, where they were, into where they're going as well, building a very strategic and tactical plan to be able to preserve but also grow, and be part of their whole system. For those that want to reach out to you, that have those questions, that say, hey, I don't have the defense, there's some red flags that I should be aware of, that may have a little bit more questions to unpack a little bit further. Dermot, how do they reach out to you and be part of what you got going on, my man?
Well, there's a couple different ways. If you go to the paragonwealth.com website on the team view, I mean, we have a number of people working at our firm, and so if they want to connect directly with me, my contact info is right there in my bio. So I would invite that. The other thing they can also do, just if they come on to LinkedIn, is they can just message me via LinkedIn. Those are probably the two easiest, quickest ways. And we're highly responsive, and typically the point is just my first question to most people is how can we help? And and that starts the conversation, and then we just try to see where and how we can help. And sometimes it's just simply some guidance on our side, but we're not going to be working with you directly, meaning we're not engaging. On the other hand, if there's a good fit and there's a need and that type of thing, I mean, we're like I said, we're selective with the purpose of being able to deliver the right things to the right people. And if we're not, what we try to do is direct you to a better resource if it just doesn't seem that it's a fit for us, and that type of thing. So anyone who were to reach out, just they can know that and rely on the fact that it's we always just want to do right by anyone we're interacting with, and that sort of thing. And particularly from your ecosystem here, Christian, we'd be glad to just be that resource.
100%, guys, and Dermot, I really appreciate you mentioning that as well, because of the value add approach, instead of just coming in like we talked about throughout this whole conversation, instead of being that transactional approach, and that's what makes you unorthodox in your approach as well. So I appreciate that, guys. Those links are in the description below, so make sure you stop what you're doing. I will put his actual link, his paragonwealth.com. I'll put his direct information down in the description, so you can reach out to him on LinkedIn as well as email there. So make sure if you guys have any questions, or if you guys are sitting in there and saying, okay, we've got rock and roll, my business rock and roll, or adjusting or modifying as the landscape is changing and the macroeconomic side of things, make sure you have that defensible model in place and that moat around your house, because you do not want to be in a situation where all of a sudden that wind blows, which it is blowing right now on the macro side of things, and you want to make sure that you are solidified on good foundation. And the Paragon Wealth and their team can definitely help you solidify that. Guys, that is my friend Dermott Larkin at Wealth Advisory at Paragon Wealth. My friend. Guys, that's Journey with Christian D. Evans podcast. Until next time, be uncommon if you can.